Books, books. I like books. I'm gonna read them all. Hi readers, Chris here. Welcome to my channel where I review fantasy, Stephen King, all sorts of books. Today I'm playing catch up with a double review and I'm going to be talking about The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna and Britt-Marie Was Here by Fredrik Backman. I'm going to try to keep this as short and sweet as possible, so let's start with The Gilded Ones. The Gilded Ones is a YA fantasy, and I actually received this copy in an old Owl Crate book box. I want to say this might have been one of the first books that I ever actually got in an Owl Crate book box, and clearly it took me a long time to read it. But the setup of the story is that we have a young girl named Decca. She lives in this village where people either have gold or regular red blood. And it's the women that have gold blood. So when the young girls turn 16, they go through this purity ceremony, basically, where they get cut. And if they are found to have gold blood, then they are killed because they are impure. So, of course, Decca, it's her 16th birthday. She's looking forward to the ceremony because she really wants to prove that she's not impure, that she's, good enough for the village. And lo and behold, she has gold blood. But when she's sentenced to death, a mysterious woman shows up and says, hey, you can stay here and die, or you can leave your village and everything you've ever known, and you can come and fight in the Emperor's army. Because the Emperor is putting together this, special task force, basically, of all these gold-blooded girls, because guess what? They have powers. Oh yes, oh yes. If you read YA fantasy at all, you've heard this story a million times before. If you've read the Red Queen series, they had red and silver blood differences, but that whole trope of certain people are impure because of the color of their blood, that's been done before. Women and young girls being seen as less than, that's been done before. Secret armies and secret task force, that's been done before. And of course, it wouldn't be a YA fantasy without a romance. But even though this story does have a lot of these common tropes that you see in a lot of YA fantasy, I think that they were handled pretty well here. I think overall, this was a really fun story. I think Decca is a fun character, a wonderful character, and I like her journey as she starts to discover that this gold blood isn't like a negative thing, but it's actually giving her powers and giving her the ability to fight back in her life. And of course, this is just kind of like a really general overview. There are other things going on in the book. Once Decca joins this army, she finds out that things aren't exactly as they seem. She's not even exactly as she seems. So I think there's enough new stuff in here to make the book enjoyable. And I would say the number one thing that I found enjoyable about this book is that it has a ton of action in it. It has a lot of action. Because Decca is in this army, the army spends a lot of time training and then going on these missions. And the book is not that long. It's like a standard size book, but we actually go on missions a lot. So you get to see Decca and her fellow female warriors fight a lot, which I found to be a really good thing about this book. I felt like it kept the pace moving along. So even though some of it was stuff I'd heard before, it never felt boring. However, there is one thing I will mention about that though, because there is a lot of action. Even though this is a YA book, it's considered YA, I would say that some of the action is a bit violent at times for such a YA story. Now, I'm personally not bothered by that. I'm not saying that that's negative, but if you are someone who doesn't like that in your stories, reads YA to avoid that, because, adult fantasy can be really violent at times. But this is a YA story. So I just want to mention that up front to be aware going in that that is something that is in this book. Especially in the beginning, when Decca finds out that she has the gold blood and like they're gonna kill her, and they talk about things that have happened to other girls that have had similar situations. There's no trigger warning in the beginning of this book, but I almost feel like there should be, because some people are sensitive to violence, and I think that's an important thing that the book probably should have publicized beforehand. But anyway, moving on. The other thing I did like about this book is I did like Decca's journey. I think she has a fun journey of self-discovery, both as she like kind of discovers her powers and what they can do, but also as she kind of discovers like what's really going on here, you know, what's really going on, who's really in charge, who are we really fighting. Again, things you've probably heard before if you read a lot of YA fantasy, but I think it was done here in a solid way, and it's an enjoyable book. And yes, because this is a YA fantasy, there is a romance in here. Honestly, I don't think it was needed. Like, I feel like if you're writing a YA fantasy, you feel like there has to be a romance. It just feels like a check, you know? Oh, YA fantasy needs to have a romance. There's nothing about the romance in here that's special. It's pretty standard for a YA fantasy. And honestly, I don't think the story needed it. I think the story would have been fine without it. So I don't know why that was in there, but whatever. So at the end of the day, is The Gilded Ones the best book that I've ever read? No, not really. But I did enjoy reading it. I had a fun time. I think it's a solid YA story. So if you are someone who reads a lot of YA fantasy because you love reading YA fantasy, like that's your jam, that's your genre, then yeah, I would give The Gilded Ones a try. If you are someone who can't stand YA fantasy, prefers the more adult stuff, I don't think this will change your mind. But again, I thought it was a fun book. It's a fun read, and that's all I have to say about it. Next up, I'm going to talk about Britt-Marie Was Here by Fredrik Backman. If you saw my wrap up for March, you will know this is my favorite book of the month. So I debated doing its own video, but I am so behind right now. I just have to combine some things, but this book was an absolute delight. So basically we have an older woman. Her name is Britt-Marie. She's in her 60s, and she has recently divorced from her husband, Kent. She was married to him for a number of years. So she has been living basically the same life, like forever. Like she's had the same life, been with the same person, lived in the same place. Like she's had the same life for a very long time. But now all of a sudden she finds herself alone. She's got no job. She's got no money. She doesn't have a lot of skills because when she was married to her husband, she didn't work. She just took care of the house. And she's really kind of lost. Like they don't say that like flat out, but it's implied through the story that like she's really lost. Even though she seems like very uppity at first, very particular. She likes things done a certain way. She has a specific brand of like Windex, a specific brand of cleaner that she likes to use. Like she's very particular. You have to use coasters, like all this stuff. And in the beginning, it seems like, okay, it seems like she is almost living in a fantasy world. Like she doesn't want to admit to herself like where she has ended up. She doesn't want to admit to herself. She's always thinking about her husband, her ex-husband, even though he's no longer there. She's always noticing the white band that she has on her finger because she wore her wedding band for so long that it's left a mark, and now that it's not there, like she can see it. So anyway, so she goes into this unemployment office to look for her job. And of course the lady there like can't be bothered with this crazy old lady who's trying to get a job. So she basically sends her out to this small town that is in the middle of nowhere. This small town that's basically been forgotten by society, and says, hey, you can work at the recreation center there. So Britt-Marie shows up in this town, shows up at this rec center. There's a bunch of kids. They're playing soccer in a parking lot. And little by little, she starts to meet all the different characters that live in this town. And there's a lot of characters in this town. There's a bunch of kids in this town that like playing soccer. There's a police officer who seems really nice. There's the guy that runs the pizzeria that drinks a lot. Like, there's so many characters in this charming little town. And the more time that Britt-Marie spends there, the more time that Britt-Marie spends in this town, the more time she starts to realize that maybe things could be different for her. Maybe she could have a different life. Like, maybe she could have a new life, even though she doesn't have the things that she always thought she needed. And it's like, again, it's just a beautiful, touching story, because all of the things that I'm saying, like, none of these things are spoken aloud, none of them are mentioned. But when you read it, it all comes through in the writing, it all comes through in the plot, it all comes through in the characters, and it's just a really, really sweet story. And this book made me cry not once, but twice. It made me cry once because there is, like, something really sad that happens near the end of the book that I was not expecting at all. There is a twist that happens. I'm not going to say what it is. That would be spoilers. But there is something a little shocking that happens towards the end of the book that absolutely broke my heart and made me sob. And then, shortly after that, at the very, very, very end of the book, I cried a tear of happiness. This is one of those books that you have to read, like, until the very, very, very last page. The very last page. Because honestly, even going into the final chapter, I think I was annoyed at some of the choices that Britt-Marie was making. I was like, why? The book cannot end like this. There's only 10 pages left. It cannot end like this. But then, of course, it ended the way that I wanted it to, so that made me so happy that I cried tears of joy. So yes, all that to say, I really got into this book. I really got into it. If you have read any of other Fredrik Backman's book, specifically A Man Called Ove, if you liked A Man Called Ove, you will love Britt-Marie Was Here, and you should definitely read it. If you hated A Man Called Ove, you probably aren't going to like this one any better. Although, when I compare Ove as a character versus Britt-Marie as a character, I do think that Britt-Marie is easier to fall in love with and easier to care about than Ove was. This isn't a review on A Man Called Ove, but in that story, you also have an older gentleman, and he is very grumpy. Britt-Marie is not grumpy. She's not a grumpy old lady. She's just very particular, if that makes sense. So anyway, Britt-Marie Was Here is a wonderful book. It's heartwarming. It's full of joy. It's sad at times, but I absolutely loved it. That is it for me today. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you get a Swiper! Woohoo! Swiper just woke up and she is very squirmy. She's a squirmy little worm today. Oh my goodness, Swiper. Can you not sit still for a second? No, she's a squirmy little worm today. You cannot jump out of my arms. You will die. All right, I will put you down. Be right back. Do not bite my toes, Swiper. That is it for me today. As always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already, please subscribe to my channel for more bookish stuff coming your way soon. All right, everyone, happy reading.